Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and I just finished watching 2020's The Trial of the Chicago 7. Now, Trial of Chicago 7 is a film written and directed by Aaron Sorkin. I can't recall whether it's his directorial debut or not. It's one of his first movies that he's directed, but he is a legendary figure as a writer and producer. I don't recall if I've spoken about Sorkin before, but you can always tell when Sorkin's writing. And I'm sort of jumping the gun a little on this here, but the script is very, very good. Now, he's not without his flaws or his cliches, but his dialogue composition is undeniably one of the best of the current era of filmmaking. Admittedly, he's done a lot more TV than he has movies, but his movies also have that same sort of flavor. And if you watch enough of his work, you start to recognize it even when you don't know it's coming. So to see him as the director on this is kind of interesting. I know that in the last couple of years he's been branching out a bit more. He has written a bunch of stage plays before, but I don't think he's directed them before. But he's become more and more involved in those productions as I understand it. So as for this film itself, the Trial of the Chicago 7 is well, let me step back for a second. It's hard to talk about this film without talking about politics and political history and the state of education, blah, blah, blah. I generally try and keep politics out of this channel, but it's going to be sort of undeniable or unavoidable here. So I just want to touch on this for a second. In my experience, and from the experiences I have gleaned from people who people I know, in a very serious, there's a very serious issue with. Well, there's a lot of very serious issues with education in the United States, but one of them is history education in the United States in public schooling is seriously problematic in terms of what it includes and doesn't include. And in most people's experience that I have been led to understand is pretty universal. We don't get very much taught about the era basically after World War II up through the 80s. A lot of that era, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the civil rights, like the civil rights era of the 60s, into the 70s and 80s as the sort of countercultural movements and all these other things would grow. A lot of that is not very well taught. For some understandable reasons, a lot of it is somewhat controversial. But the complete lack of recognition of it by a lot of the general public is troubling. History is important, even when it's difficult or controversial, and not having an educated populace is how you get a lot of ignorant behavior. So it's hard to talk about this film outside of that context because for a lot of people, this is going to be the first time they hear about the trial of the Chicago 7 or the Democratic National Convention and the riots in Chicago or a lot of the things that surround that. And it is very hard to untangle any part of that era, like literally a decade plus of politics, international politics, domestic politics, cultural movements, and all these other sorts of things. It's hard to pull out any certain part of it without realizing all the things it's attached to. That said, I think this movie does an excellent job of highlighting what it needs to highlight, even if it has some omissions. For some context, if you are not familiar, the Midwest and the what would become called the Rust Belt in the 60s and on, well, really starting from the 50s, had a lot of economic issues because of declining production like factory jobs and those sorts of things, and really led to a lot of the decline of some of the cities in that area, including places like Detroit is legendary for, basically falling to pieces. Chicago was really the exception, in no small part due to the leadership of Mayor Richard Daley. However, Mayor Richard Daley and his cadre of politicians were legendarily corrupt and ruled with an iron fist. And even though he probably saved Chicago from a substantial portion of the economic ruin it would have otherwise had, as a political figure, he is not looked on all that favorably, and especially as an opponent, as someone who held on to the ideas of the Democratic Party as it existed in the prior part of the 20th century, and his resistance to anti-war protesters, countercultural movements, and those sorts of things. In that realm, there are a lot of problems, but I'm not going to spend this entire video talking about him. This is more of just a setup for the context, and I think it's important because in some ways that is really the thing that is most avoided in this film. They do try and couch the narrative in the context of the era, but there's only so much you can do in a relatively short film. How long is this in total? 130 minutes. So it feels shorter than that. It runs at a good clip, but that's Sorkin for you. He knows how to pace his dialogue. It's incredibly impressive, honestly. So, the trial of the Chicago 7 is a rather legendary trial in both political and judicial circles, for being really emblematic. Well, I meant to mute my computer and I didn't. Whoops. Emblematic of the era in terms of Daley's reign over Chicago, the political issues between the Democratic and Republican parties, and the sort of countercultural movements and various other things that were going on in the general public at that time, and was an exemplar of the corruption and the misapplication of justice that was widespread at the time and certainly didn't stop after. But this was a high-profile case, and was so egregiously poorly executed that it's legendary. It's infamous. And I guess I should talk about the plot, in a sense. this is fundamentally, essentially a courtroom drama. However, I don't want to like give it the wrong idea because, as with Sorkin, usually there's always some aspect of comedy. It's not generally laugh out loud, but it's very has a lot of humorous aspects to it. I think Sorkin in general does a great job of knowing how to incorporate variety into dialogue and into general content to ensure that a drama does not become too dour or sort of grating, especially given the content herein, which is, basically 2 hours of watching people's rights be violated. So, with that in mind, in addition to the courtroom aspects, they do flashes to the events that are being considered, the protests slash riots, and all these other things. And those are all executed extremely well. They're well paced, well written. All these other things just impressively done. Especially, Sorkin's been in the industry for a long time. So obviously he's had a lot of exposure to, other people directing. But as a director, credit where it's due for, that being as good as it is. So it's shot well, it's composed well, it's written well. The story, like I said before, keeps to the most relevant aspects because, again, it's hard to disentangle the story from all of the things that would surround it. And I think it makes all the cuts where they seem appropriate. Obviously, there is some liberty taken as well with the events as they transpired in the courtroom and outside of it. So it's, it's not nonfiction. It's not untouched or kept to strict historical accuracy. But again, as with Sorkin, as Sorkin tends to do, tries to keep it as close to existing material as is reasonable without sacrificing sort of the artistic vision, I would say. The tone in general is really good, knows how to go between sort of these quiet moments to the somber and frustrating to comedic and like borderline absurd, because of the what the topic that they're addressing. This is the trial itself is farce basically, and so it's hard not for that to like swing around. It needs to swing around for it not to seem just painful to watch, and I think they execute that really well. Some of the sets and costumes are a little bit, I mean, it's not something you notice that much. The main characters are all dressed appropriately and that sort of thing. Some of the extras and things in the larger scenes or in the background look a little bit out of place if you have an eye for it, in terms of not quite looking like, the clothing or the styles of the late 60s, but it's a minor thing generally. As far as the main cast goes, I wouldn't say it's a star-studded cast, but it's got some certainly some notable names on it. Frankly, I think the standout is actually Sacha Baron Cohen, who we've talked about before in context of the Borat films, which if you haven't seen that episode, go watch it. But in summary, I don't particularly like either of those films, but I already expressed in that I think Sacha Baron Cohen is a talented and very smart person. And to see him flex his acting chops here, I think is excellent. He's not like extraordinary. But as far as saying, yeah, I knew that guy could do that. I knew he had that in him, that capability, to, give a nuanced performance of a real character with depth. He absolutely does. I think he does an excellent job. Everyone around him also is great. I mean, yeah, that's really all I can say. I could list all the actors. Some of them are a bit famous. Some of them are, notable character actors. But generally speaking, the cast is fantastic. There was nobody who I thought was particularly out of place. Yeah, really well done there. Just generally pretty impressed with what they accomplished in a general sense. Like I said about the way the directing and how that was all composed, I thought that was really good. The cinematography itself is not like, it's not extraordinary, but it's very competent. Like I said, with Sorkin as director, I don't know who the DP was on this, but presumably Sorkin has worked in the industry for so long. I'm sure it was somebody who he's probably worked with before, or who he selected based on a compatibility. Definitely shot well for Sorkin's dialogue, for Sorkin's writing. So generally pretty well done there. There were a couple of shots where I thought the lighting was a little funny, or could have been, they could have gone a little bit more aggressive, had a little bit more impressive of a shot, but it's fundamentally mostly a courtroom drama, so it's only going to get so crazy, right? My one gripe with the film is actually at the end, where at the very end of the film, and I'm going to try and keep this spoiler free. It's essentially, the ending is not only the most divergent from the actual reality of what happened, but also hits this like bizarrely saccharine note, especially for Sorkin, who tends not to shy away from the hard stuff, but it feels very out of place, where it just sort of gives this what appears to be like an over the top feel good kind of ending, or at least attempts one, and it leaves a very odd taste in your mouth coming out of it. But in the context of the rest of the film, I don't know. It's a black mark on it, but it's not, the worst thing in the world. So yeah, on the whole, I quite liked the film. It's not really extraordinary in any way, but especially with the cultural and political climate of our current times, I think it's an important historical event for people to be more aware of. And I can't think of anyone else I'd probably like to have adapt it more than Sorkin. And I think he does great justice to it. I think all of the actors put on a great show. And I think it's a very prescient film for our current times, and one that everybody should watch. It's not hard to watch either. It's an easy watch. I don't feel like I have to explain what that means, but it's you don't have to prepare yourself for it. So anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.